Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Top 3 Enterprise Risks Addressed by DevOps, brought to you by ASPE. I'd like to introduce to you our presenters. Alan Koch is a Senior Lead Instructor at ASPE. Alan provides training, coaching, and consulting services primarily in subjects related to DevOps, Agile, and software testing. Next, we have Chris Knott, and he's a longtime technology maven and training solutions director. He connects enterprise skills needs with emerging tools and subject matter experts who can meet those needs.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll kick it off here. This is Chris, and the way this will work here is Alan and I will kind of tag team the conversation with Alan in the lead as the senior expert here. Today's topic is the top 3 enterprise risks addressed by DevOps. So the idea here is that DevOps benefits are not just for IT. DevOps benefits, in fact, are intended to apply to the entire organization at large. While Alan gets those finalized here, I'll just go ahead and get things going by referencing the 2017 State of DevOps report. Now, anybody who's interested in DevOps is probably familiar with the State of DevOps report put out by Puppet every year for about 6 or 7 years now, and now just as of recently, DORA as well. DORA, the DevOps Research and Assessment Group, startup founded by Jez Humble, Gene Kim, and Nicole Forsgren, who have been the custodians of Puppet's data. So the State of DevOps report essentially is a report that says very similar conclusions year over year, which are essentially that if you have a high-performing IT department, it's a predictor of many, many successful business outcomes. And they're very desirable outcomes that everybody wants to achieve. Essentially, things like much lower turnover, much higher throughput on the part of the teams, much faster and more robust software and systems delivery, and a whole host of others that obviously have driven, I think, the interest in DevOps as a movement on behalf of sort of the mainstream industry community and not just technology mavens. So, but you may notice one thing, which is that State of DevOps report, the conclusions essentially are all upside. And as we know, if you think about it, anytime that something indicates an upside or a benefit, then there's always going to be a flip side. So there's a converse way of looking at it. And so in order to protect yourselves from these risks, that's the angle that we want to take here today. So that tees us up, I think, for today's conversation. And with that, Alan, I'll kick it over to you.
Sure.
And you tell me if I have summed up the exposition accurately here.
Yeah, DevOps definitely has lots of kinds of benefits, and really what we're highlighting today is the benefits that are associated with risk reduction. The 2 key findings that we're highlighting on the screen here are the 2 that really have the biggest impact on organizational risks. One of them, Chris, you actually pointed to this idea of faster throughput and the ability to get things done. The other one is also a very interesting one, the fact that high-performing organizations are much more likely to meet their business objectives, not IT objectives, not technical issues, but actual business objectives. So these 2 are out of this year's State of DevOps report are the 2 things that lead us to the kinds of risk reduction that we're talking about here. So when we say 3 enterprise risks addressed by DevOps, these are the 3 that we're going to be talking about today. The first one, of course, is competition. Everyone is up against competition, and staying ahead of the competition or keeping up with the competition is one of the huge challenges that most any organization has. The second one is business interruption. The last thing we need is for our business to be just completely unavailable, our services unavailable to our customers, our our product's not there. And then the third one relates to our employees, employee turnover. So every organization has these issues. Now, competition is mainly focused on profit-making organizations, although organizations that are not profit-making face a similar kind of thing. But the second and third one, absolutely any organization worries about those. So let's take a look at them. So the first one is competition. The reality is that we need to remain competitive. That's the real necessity that you have in business. And the term that's become really popular these days is business agility. That's how you stay up to date. That's how you stay competitive. That's how you stay relevant with your customers, is to be able to be agile as a business. And that's really what enables competitiveness. So business agility is what many organizations are trying to achieve. The only way that we can actually achieve business agility is if our IT organization can be responsive to the needs of the business. So this gets to that first point we're making. High performance IT organizations that have done a good job of implementing DevOps, one of the main benefits they get out of it is their IT organization is able to be responsive to the needs of the business for changes to IT services, new IT services, any of those kinds of things. And so that's what we're looking at here. DevOps really does allow organizations to achieve better business agility because DevOps makes their IT organizations much more responsive to the need for change. So this is the starting point here. We can be more competitive if indeed our DevOps, our IT organization is using DevOps to enable them to be much more agile. But it doesn't just end there. That's actually the start of it. And almost any organization, even when they're first getting started with DevOps, starts seeing some increases in IT responsiveness, which of course can drive business agility relatively early. It doesn't take too long for that to start to happen. But it goes beyond that. DevOps actually enables IT organizations then to achieve these things. The IT organizations, our teams are agile. They're able to move quickly. One of the things DevOps teaches us is about doing work in small batches. One of the reasons why many IT organizations are not responsive is because they try to do these large projects that take a long time to do. And it seems like from the time the business says, oh, we need something, it takes months and months or sometimes years for their IT organization to respond. DevOps teaches us to do work in small batches. And that's part of the reason why the IT organizations that are doing this start becoming more responsive very, very quickly as they move forward. And the other reason is this idea of automation. If you're doing things manually, it simply takes time. And DevOps teaches us how to make effective use of automation to make things faster. And let's face it, an automated process, a script or a tool that does something is going to be able to do it much more quickly than a person could ever do it. So the automation also helps with this responsiveness. And then finally, automation in testing allows us to verify. Now, this is really important because moving quickly, if you're making mistakes, that can be a real problem. But with automated testing, we're also able to quickly verify what's going on. So now we don't need to have months and months of testing in order to verify that what we have just done is appropriate. And of course, QA and security, making sure that we have built in the quality and built in the security that's necessary, and doing it in a collaborative way. So again, it's not something that is a roadblock to us being able to move more quickly. So these are benefits right off the bat. But then what we see is as organizations get more and more mature in their implementation of DevOps, as this happens, then you start seeing a shift happen where IT is able to actually start getting out ahead of the demand of the business for these changes. And the business agility, IT starts being able to keep up with the demand. And so what that means now is this maturity, and this takes a while to get to, but this maturity in the IT organization now allows them to start really innovating. So now IT is now out of the business of trying to run to keep up with the demand of what the business has, and able to get out in front of that demand curve and start innovating. Now, the cool part about this is it's not just IT that benefits from these innovations. You do see a lot of benefit to IT, but you also see then that IT is able to help the business to innovate. Business agility really is a matter of envisioning where could we go and how can we keep up and how can we do better than our customers do. And our business people do a good job of thinking about those things. But IT can also be a really important contributor here. And these high-performance IT organizations that have gotten out ahead of that demand curve find that they are able to help the business to come up with new innovations that they can do. And of course, this can result in real competitive breakthrough. So now we're not talking in terms of keeping up with the competition. When you start getting having these kinds of breakthroughs now, you start becoming the competition that everyone else is trying to keep up with. So this is really the ultimate benefit here, is not just that we can keep up with the competition, but that we can actually start getting out ahead of the competition. And that is huge. It's not something you get immediately. It takes a lot of work to get to that point of being able to be way out ahead. But this is what we see in high-performing DevOps organizations, is the organization being able to truly innovate and really break out ahead of the pack competitively. So that's our number one risk that DevOps really helps with. And you can see it helps. It doesn't just help. I mean, this is a powerful way that DevOps really benefits your organization. So risk number one, competition, helps us to get out way ahead of competition. All right, so that was risk number one. Risk number two is business interruption. This is a fear that you have in most organizations. And in fact, the idea of business continuity planning is very important, because the last thing that you want is for your business to be stopped in its tracks because of some disaster. Now, many organizations do indeed suffer IT failures that rise to the level of being disasters. And so IT failures are not the only kind of disasters we need to worry about, but they certainly are important features on that continuity landscape, if you will. Now, when you talk about DevOps, one of the mantras that we hear in DevOps is automate everything you can. So that's really what helps us to address this issue of business interruption that are caused by IT failures here. The automation that we put into place doesn't just make us faster, right? So we talked on the prior page about how it helps us to go faster, but it doesn't just help us to move faster. It also helps us to avoid the kinds of issues that cause serious failures in our shop. So the first way automation does this is through standardization. Everybody knows that standardized approaches and standardized processes and standards are a great way to ensure that we're always doing the right thing, and of course, by extension, not doing the wrong thing that's going to cause us problems and issues. If you automate, then there's no question that those standards are being followed, right? When people are doing things manually, Well, they may or may not be following standards. But when you automate, you know for sure that those tools, those scripts, those mechanisms that you have put into place are doing it correctly all the time. And so that standardization means that we will always be doing the right thing. And speaking of the word always, that of course is another piece of it here, consistency. We know exactly how it gets done. We know that it will be done the same way every time because the tool is not going to vary, which of course points us at really the crux of the matter. The idea that when things are being done by hand, when people are the ones who are doing it, consistency is very, very difficult. Consistency is just foreign to humans. I mean, we even if we want to be consistent, it's very difficult for us to achieve it. So having people involved in any process always raises the fear of failure. Just because people make mistakes. I mean, we're human. We make mistakes. And so the more we automate, essentially, the more we are now removing people's hands from the process. And that, of course, means that we're going to have a lot fewer IT failures because that human source of failure now is moved away from the process. So automation is the starting point here for making sure we have fewer IT failures. But it's actually not the only one. DevOps helps us to avoid IT failures in other ways as well. For instance, DevOps helps us to recover more quickly when things do go wrong. The reality is things will go wrong. There's so much complexity in IT systems that avoiding failure altogether is probably not in the cards. So it teaches us how to recover quickly. Now, there's a number of mechanisms for that actually help us to recover quickly. So the first one is the concept of the swarm. So the idea of swarming, of course, is that all of the people who are involved in a particular activity, when something goes wrong, they come together. Literally, they swarm. I mean, the word swarm is very indicative of what we're talking about here. And DevOps teaches us how to do that, how to set up the telemetry so that we know immediately when something is wrong, and then how to react to it in a swarm so that we can actually understand what's happening and, of course, take quicker action. So this idea of swarming is one way that DevOps teaches us to react more quickly so that any failures we have are likely to be resolved much more quickly. And of course, automation comes in again. Automation, if you're talking about being able to recover more quickly here, if people have to fix the problem, if it's a matter of a person running to the rescue, it's going to take a lot longer than if I have some automated means of responding to the problem. Literally, very often the kinds of failures we see in IT, a person fixing it is probably going to take at least minutes, if not hours, in order to actually make the changes they need to make and get the problem taken care of. In the worst cases, you're talking hours, but at least minutes. If you have an automated response to whatever it is that went wrong, literally the problem can be fixed within seconds, if not minutes. So you're talking very significant changes in your mean time to recover when you automate the recovery process. And that's a big part of what we see. The automation in DevOps doesn't just allow us to do our initial work more quickly. It also enables us to respond to issues more quickly as well. But then there's another piece to fast recovery, and I kind of alluded to that a few minutes ago, and that is the telemetry. DevOps teaches us how to put the right telemetry into place so that we actually do see problems as they occur. And obviously, it's best if problems don't happen, but the next best thing to problems not happening is that we see them as they're happening so we can begin our response immediately. Literally, we're talking about getting to the point where we never learn about a problem because somebody called the service desk. We see the problem. We in IT know about the problem at least as soon as anybody else or any of our users, and potentially before any of our users have figured it out, so that we can begin this response process more quickly. And indeed, that's actually a metric you'd want to look at. Are we still finding out about problems because somebody called the help desk? If that's the case, then we don't have the telemetry in place that we need, because we should be seeing these problems before our users see the problems. And of course, if you combine this, see the problems as they occur, and then have an automated means of responding to the problem, we are likely to be able to fix the problem before the user finishes dialing the phone. I mean, that's the kind of picture we're talking about. And when you can respond to failures that quickly, they are not going to be classified as business interruption. Having a hiccup, having something that's broken for a few minutes, that is not a disaster in almost any case. So this becomes a really important part of avoiding these kinds of disaster situations. So we have the automation, we have faster recovery. There's more than that. DevOps also teaches us how to be continually improving the reliability and resiliency of the services that we provide. So it's increasing resiliency. And this is, again, like with the first risk, this is something that builds over time. As an organization's DevOps implementation gets more and more mature, then what you see is their services become more and more resilient. So there's a number of reasons why that happens. The first one, as we see here, is we learn from failure. What do you do when things go wrong? Right? In many organizations, there's almost a knee-jerk reaction that, when something goes wrong, we want to find out who to blame. Well, that's actually not a terribly productive way to increase the resiliency of our services. When you're looking for who to blame, it might feel like we're trying to keep it from happening again. If people get called on the carpet, they're not going to be making those mistakes again. But the reality is that when you get into that mode of operation, people start being fearful for their jobs. They actually start doing some counterproductive things like hiding information and that sort of thing. It really isn't useful. What's useful is to treat any failure that we do experience as an opportunity to learn. And if we do that, then what that means is anytime we have a failure, the net result of that failure is that we are less likely to see that kind of failure in the future, or we are more likely to be able to respond more quickly than we had, or whatever, because we're going to be learning from it. So that's one of the most important pieces of dealing with failures, not fixing it. Well, obviously fixing it is important, but in addition to fixing whatever it is that went wrong, then taking that step back and saying, and how can we get better as a result of that? So increasing resiliency just comes from us as professionals learning. And of course, when you learn, what are you going to be doing? Well, we might put more automated mechanisms in place. We might add some more validations, whatever, but we're going to be improving some of these things we already talked about, because we look at the failure and say, gee, how could we keep that from happening again? So learning how to learn from failure. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, learning how to learn. Another thing that DevOps teaches us about is this idea of improving our testing anytime a defect escapes being caught. Now, the term an escape defect, as we're referring to it here on this page, excuse me, is referring to the case where we did testing, but during that testing, the defect escaped being detected. And so, of course, our users are the ones who told us about the defect. Gee, this is starting to sound familiar, isn't it? We don't want to be learning about defects from our users, just like we don't want to be learning about system failures from our users. We want to catch them ourselves. And so what we want to do, again, is almost the same heading as the prior thing I was talking about here. All right, a defect that makes it out into the hands of the user is a kind of failure that we need to learn from. And so every time we have an escape defect, we don't just fix the defect. We also look at the testing we're doing and say, okay, how is it that that particular defect escaped being detected? And then we look at the testing that we have in place and we make improvements to the testing we have in place so that similar kinds of things are not going to escape detection in the future. So what this means is that over time, our testing is going to get better and better. This is a challenge. How do you do good testing? It's a challenge every organization faces. And even when you have really, really good test professionals who are coming up with good testing strategies and good automation to put the testing into place, it's still never going to be perfect, right? Again, that human element, it's people who come up with testing strategies and people who build these tests. And so, yes, defects will escape. We can learn every time a defect escapes, improve our testing, and then that means that we are going to have fewer defects being detected overall. So that is a contributor to our increased resiliency. The third contributor to increased resiliency is, again, becoming more and more proactive, I guess would be the word. So we talked a couple pages back about seeing problems as they occur. So instead of finding out about them after the fact, seeing them as they occur. Well, as we get more mature in our telemetry and more mature in our DevOps implementation, we can actually now get better than merely seeing the problems as they occur and start anticipating problems and start identifying situations where problems are likely to be coming so we can take preemptive action. That is the ultimate in avoiding business interruption, because now the problems don't happen at all. If we can anticipate, get out ahead of it, and take care of it before it has caused any kind of service interruption, that actually is the ultimate we want. And DevOps teaches us how to do that through statistical analysis of our telemetry. So we look at our data that we're collecting, we make sure we're collecting all of the right data, but then we can do statistical analysis of that data. And that statistical analysis can help us to understand what normal operation looks like. And by extension, that means we can start now identifying what abnormal operation looks like. Right, so you think in terms of, okay, so you might have a mean, and it should be within 2 standard deviations of the mean, whatever. And then when you see a statistic start going way outside of that norm, it gives you rise for thinking about, well, wait a minute, have we now moved into abnormal territory? And DevOps actually leads us down that road, because once you have a statistical understanding of what the performance of your services looks like, then you can do this. You can actually identify abnormal in a proactive manner so that you can take action to correct the issue before any user is even affected by it. That's the ultimate, is avoiding problems altogether. All right, so that's really what we're talking about here with anticipating problems. And again, this is something you see in the much more mature DevOps organizations. An example that is actually a very interesting example comes from Netflix. Netflix has done that kind of study of their services. Netflix is built on a microservice architecture, and they have a statistical understanding of what normal operation of every single one of their services looks like. And in fact, they are constantly recomputing their statistics based on current load and based on user activity and all of those kind of things in order to have a clear picture of what normal looks like so they can have a clear picture of abnormal. And then they have a bot in their production cloud that is constantly monitoring the stats from every service to identify when one of those services is misbehaving. And then it takes preemptive action. Because they're using a microservice architecture, they're able to kill off and reinstantiate services very easily. And that's what they do. They don't allow a service to get to the point where it's causing problems for users. If it starts misbehaving, they simply replace it. So that's one example of this idea of being able to anticipate problems. It's all based on the statistical analysis and getting a clear statistical understanding of what these things should look like. Definitely a picture of high maturity, but definitely within reach. So business interruption, oh, there's another thing. Remember, of course, goes back to continuity planning. And the reality is things do go wrong, right? It's not just IT failures that can take a business out. If your data center burns to the ground, that's not because somebody made a mistake somewhere. That's just a disaster that happened. A tornado comes through or whatever. But if your data center is destroyed or whatever, yeah, you can't prevent a lot of those kinds of disasters from happening. But DevOps even helps here. And this is a cool quote. I love this quote from Adam Jacob. DevOps, once you have all of the pieces in place, and again, this is a look down the road, enables the reconstruction of the business from nothing but a source code repository, application data backup, and bare metal resources. Think about that as a continuity plan. If your data center burned to the ground, could you reconstruct it from your source code repository, your data backup, and of course you need machines to run it on, right? Oh, wait a minute. Actually, we don't need that bare metal, do we? Could we reconstruct our business from our source code repository, application data backup, and a subscription to Amazon, AWS, or Azure, or whichever of the platform as a service that sources that you might be able to go to? That, in my mind, is the ultimate continuity plan, the ultimate IT continuity plan. Of course, it doesn't address some other parts of a business continuity plan, but from an IT continuity plan standpoint, the ability to literally rebuild everything from what we have in our source code repository is an absolutely amazing picture to draw. So this is something this is the ultimate end game in DevOps. Most organizations take years to get to the point where they could literally do this, but the high maturity DevOps organizations that we see, they are in this position. This is a position that a number of organizations are in. Many of these organizations already live in the cloud, so they're not going to have their data center burned to the ground. But the reality is there is a data center somewhere. Right, the cloud is an abstract idea. There is a data center somewhere, and the organization does have to be able to recover if that happens. We need to be able to rebuild, and being able to rebuild in the cloud makes a continuity plan even better. So, risk number 2, business interruption. Boy, what do we talk about here? 3, 4, 5 different ways that DevOps helps us here. And this is one of the most powerful things you see in DevOps, the fact that it really does help us to address this risk of business interruption. All right, so that was risk number 2, business interruption. Risk number 3 is employee turnover. So employee turnover, of course, is something every organization experiences. It's one of the things that I guess could we classically really call it a risk if you know it's going to happen. But the risk you have, of course, is having too much turnover, and then of course that turnover having a negative impact on the organization because knowledge walks out the door, experience walks out the door. When you replace an employee, of course, you're replacing them with somebody who doesn't have that background and experience of the person you lost. And so that's really the risk that we're talking about here, is the negative impact on the business from employee turnover. So there's a couple of ways that DevOps addresses this as well. The first one is the fact that employees like working in an organization that is becoming more and more mature using DevOps. This stat that you see on this page comes from last year's State of DevOps report. One of the things they reported, one of the statistics they highlighted actually in the executive summary, is that employees of the higher performing DevOps organizations were much more likely to recommend their own organizations as a great place to work. So that's a cool way to measure this idea of employee satisfaction. And they actually highlighted it in two ways that you see here. The first one, a little more than twice as likely to recommend their organization as a great place to work. And the other one is just under 2 times more likely to recommend their own team as a great place to work. So it's not just the team that they like the team, they're highly likely to recommend their own team, but also it makes the entire experience that they have in their organization better too. So this essentially says, oh, I should be able to reduce employee turnover as we become more mature in our DevOps implementation. People tend to be much happier in that kind of an environment. So that's the first way that DevOps addresses this risk, is by actually reducing the rate at which we're going to be losing employees. Not going to stop it altogether. People change employment for lots of reasons, but the idea of changing employment because you are unhappy with your current situation, that part would definitely go down as you become more mature in your DevOps implementation. The second way that DevOps helps is with knowledge sharing. DevOps actually prompts us to put in place a variety of different ways to share knowledge across the organization. So this knowledge sharing, of course, has the net effect of making it so that when an employee walks out the door, everything that employee knows doesn't walk out with them. This is something that many organizations understand, but they struggle with how to get that knowledge transfer happening. It's a challenge that is not easy to pull off in many organizations. And so knowledge sharing as a way of blunting the impact of employee turnover is an important piece. Now, DevOps teaches us about knowledge sharing in a couple of ways. The first one is by prompting us to use cross-functional teams. Now, cross-functional teams, literally what we're talking about here are teams where I have people from all different functional specialties working together. So what happens when you put them together like this is they learn from each other. And cross-functional teams, when you're talking about an effective team, not just, oh, these people from these different functions bump into each other while they're doing their work. No, I'm talking about putting them together on a team so they operate as a team. Think here, agile team, right? Where there's high collaboration going on, then team members have a shared goal and they're working towards that shared goal. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about here. In that kind of an environment, the people, the specialists will be learning from each other. A term that's just started getting popular recently is generalizing specialists. And what that is referring to is the fact that, yeah, the members of my team may very well be specialists. Each of them might have a certain discipline that they are very, very specialized and know a lot about. But when they're on these cross-functional teams, it gives them the opportunity to generalize. So that's why they're called generalizing specialists. And the cool part about it is that generalizing a little bit as a specialist does not diminish my ability to do my specialty. And in fact, it can actually make me better as a specialist, because now I know things outside of my specialty that I can apply to how I do my specialty. So cross-functional teams are one of the really important ways that knowledge gets shared on DevOps teams, because they almost always tend to be cross-functional teams. The second way is by using knowledge repositories. Now, this is something that is difficult to do. Actually, setting up a knowledge repository is easy, but getting people to use the knowledge repository is a little more challenging. But DevOps definitely teaches us about managing knowledge repositories and getting people to contribute to knowledge repositories. It basically helps us to come up with ways of setting up formal mechanisms for knowledge sharing. Part of it is knowledge repositories. Part of it might be opportunities for people to train each other, to work with each other, that sort of thing. But definitely knowledge repositories are an important part of the knowledge sharing mechanisms. But finally, guess what? We're coming back to automation yet again. And yeah, automation is a central focus in DevOps, but automation does contribute to all of these different things, and it definitely contributes to our ability to share knowledge. Because the automation, essentially the knowledge of how to do something, is encoded in the automation. So now it's no longer in somebody's head. You know, if I have some operational specialist, say a network engineer, who is the expert on how some particular thing is supposed to work, or how to configure our firewall or whatever, and that person leaves, that knowledge walks out with them. But if we have automated the management of our network and the configuration of our firewall and those kinds of things, that knowledge is now encoded in that automation. Which means, of course, that losing a person means we don't lose that automation. Now, that doesn't mean the person isn't important, because that automation has to be maintained over time. But what it does mean, though, is that the basic knowledge about how to do things is still there in the organization. So you have retained some of the most important pieces of it. So automation as a way of capturing and encoding knowledge so that it's no longer only in a person's head is one of the most effective ways that we see in DevOps of making sure we have knowledge. So that's the second way that DevOps helps us to deal with the risk of employee turnover. The third way is literally, and this is almost a repetition of things that I've said throughout the earlier parts of this webinar. It reduces our dependence on people. Because when you have collaborative cross-functional teams, when you have mechanisms put in place for knowledge sharing, when you have automation where knowledge is encoded, then essentially what that means now is that the loss of any individual is going to have less impact on our ability to keep moving forward as an organization. Now, I have to highlight here, I'm not saying that individuals are not important. I mean, this is a reality in IT. The way we get work done in IT is through the people, and having knowledgeable and capable people in our organizations. But what this means, though, is that these people are able to work with each other, collaborate with each other, share knowledge with each other, and manage the automation that we use to make things happen. These people are still indispensable, but we're making it so that when they get hit by the bus or by the lottery, hopefully, that we're not going to suffer as an organization. So that gets us through our third risk of employee turnover. So that really is the points that I wanted to make here. The three big risks that most any organization has to deal with. Keeping up with the competition, nay, getting out ahead of the competition. Dealing with business interruption, no, let's actually get out ahead of that too. Let's make it so that we're less likely to have our business interrupted and more able to recover our entire business if we need to. And of course, reducing employee turnover and reducing the impact that the inevitable turnover is going to have. So with that, I would like to open this up to any questions that you have here as I've been going through this. Chris, have we have any questions?
I think we may have some questions. I definitely have some questions of my own, so I think between those two we can do some Q&A here. So let's go ahead and do that. And Alan, I think, that was very thought-provoking information. I think it was really good foundational information based on sort of our understanding of DevOps practices, and couldn't agree more with everything you said. I do have some questions because obviously a lot of these practices and ideas are things that we teach all the time to various teams, various organizations, and so we've had opportunity to encounter a lot of the challenges that teams and organizations have run into as they try to implement these very ideas sort of that you've presented. So I think, that is the first question I would like to ask, and I'll highlight a couple of these common challenges because I think, when you talk about risk, and, you've certainly, I think, hit on three of the most important, if not the most important risks associated with DevOps and the sort of the why behind DevOps. But when you talk about risk, you also run into risks in a different way, right? Like as you try to implement the DevOps practice. And so, and I'll just kind of start backwards with the last one there, the employee turnover risk. I think that is such an important risk because, I think what we didn't actually explicitly state there was in the Puppet State of DevOps report, they consistently have reported that when they collect all this data and they run all these statistics, what they find is that the single most predictive factor for IT performance is IT employee satisfaction. Makes perfect sense if you think about it, but most organizations are not really paying attention to this. They don't understand that if you aren't paying attention to and measuring and watching the trend line regarding your retention and your satisfaction in the technology group, then you are missing a very important fortune-telling factor that can tell you if you're going to have technology problems or not, and thus innovation and all these upsides, right? So the question is, when you're talking about the employee retention, the lack of turnover, the satisfaction factor, et cetera, when you're talking about these issues, how do you evangelize to the leaders who should be paying attention to this? How can you get their attention and make this case? And then the other question too is just who should you make this case to? Who are the leaders? Who are the people who should sponsor somebody paying attention to this type of information? Because usually if we're inside the IT department, it doesn't really help us. Like if we're inside the IT department, we probably already know this. But, it's somebody outside of IT who probably should be paying attention to it and using that information. So just maybe talk about, who would those collaborators be? And how can we get to them? How can we get them to help us leverage this information?
Well, I think the key thing here is that you do need to address the executive level of the organization. Yes, IT is IT, and one of the issues that we've seen in so many organizations is that IT is simply treated as a cost center. And when you look at something as being a cost center, your focus is on cost reduction. And so this is actually one of the things we need to address right off the bat, is the fact that IT has the potential of being far more than just a cost of business. And indeed, I highlighted that under that first under the first risk of business innovation, right? Or competition. The idea that IT can be far more than just a cost center. IT can be far more than just, oh, we provide some structure or services that allow the business to do their thing. IT actually can be an innovation engine. So it starts really with giving that view, that vision, to the people who are in leadership position, to recognize that IT is more than just a utility. Most businesses are not in the IT business, right? If you build cars, you're in the car business. If you are in pharmaceuticals, you're making medicines. And so getting people to recognize that regardless of what business they're in, IT can be an innovation engine for the organization, and essentially getting the thinking that IT can rise way further than just being a cost center. And this is something that we actually are seeing.
Yeah, so the innovation case, I think that's obviously a great answer. But you raise an interesting idea too, that there may be a way to evangelize the case for DevOps outside of people who you typically think about as thinking about DevOps, namely IT people. Because if you think about it, what is IT really? IT is probably some of the smartest people in your entire company. You might not think of them that way because they perform very specific functions, but the reality is that your system administrators, network staff, software engineers, QA testers, your security, anybody who has engineering chops is smart. And usually, a lot of times, I think that the smarts of those people are actually underestimated by the business. The way that they treat that department certainly belies underestimation, I would say. So if you can make the case that, hey, if you can just set up a system where you're not putting smart people into a miserable work situation, then you may just unlock an explosion of creativity that can solve a lot of your business's problems. Do you think there might be somebody in IT who could build a statistical tracking application to help your pharmaceutical R&D departments arrive at breakthroughs faster? I'll bet there probably is, but
That's
you
right.
don't know unless you ask, right? So and if you go to the executives and you say, you need to make lives better for the people in your IT department. If the executive says, we have a great culture and a gym and a coffee shop, our people are happy, you should press them on that. If you're a consultant or if you're a champion or somebody trying to evangelize IT DevOps practices, you should press these people on that. You said, well, is that so? Have you measured this? What do your measurements look like? What do your retention statistics look like? And what does your have you asked the people doing the work if they're happy? And I'd want to see the data behind that survey. Chances are that executive may be surprised. They may not have done that, because a lot of times executives and people in business, like it or not, a lot of times they just have assumptions that don't necessarily align with reality. Let's move to another question, Alan.
Okay.
Our next question here, we have probably time for a couple more, and I think this is a great question here. But this person asks, how does technology evolution, and they give the example of the areas of AI and machine learning, impact DevOps and its maturity in the organization? I think that's a great question. I certainly have some ideas about it, but Alan, why don't you take a crack?
Okay, I'll start with my ideas about it here, and it's very similar to what I talked about here. This idea of really understanding things in a very, very discrete way. DevOps teaches us about having good telemetry in place, but what we do with that information that we gain starts becoming really, really important. And obviously, we can have people noodling over it as much as we want. But AI is becoming more and more of a way for dealing with the mass of information we need to work with. We talk about, in DevOps, we talk about this idea of pervasive telemetry. Well, if we actually do have pervasive telemetry, then we're generating way more data than people can deal with. We need to have these mechanisms for analyzing and understanding and making sense out of masses of data in order for us to be able to do things like we talked about here, anticipating problems. And the example I gave of Netflix is really bordering on AI. I mean, AI is kind of a hard thing to define, but the idea that the software is constantly monitoring itself, constantly recomputing what normal looks like, and then killing off things that are not operating correctly and reinstantiating them. I mean, you're starting to move down that road. So I think you're absolutely right that is going to be an important part of the ongoing move in the DevOps community towards becoming more and more resilient and being able to do a better job of providing service to our customers.
I think that's a great answer, Alan. I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned sort of the volume of telemetry data. That's an ideal opportunity for something like AI, which we would define as probably some type of machine learning. But what are those types of applications good at? They're good at seeing patterns in gigantic, boring, repetitive data sets that are too big and those patterns too subtle for humans to see. That is what AI applications have begun to be good at. And of course, in order to learn and get better, they need large volumes of data sets. And that fits very well the description of production IT telemetry. So by all means, teach somebody on your team how to use TensorFlow. We have time probably for one question really quickly, Alan, and we have only actually one question left, so that works out great. And we'll have to be brief. This person asks, what do you estimate as the impact of PaaS, that's for anybody to know, that's a platform as a service, versus building a DevOps practice around various products, especially when platform as a service reduces IP around these products? So it sounds like this person is asking about the difference between building a DevOps practice around a bunch of public as a service products in the cloud versus perhaps creating your own products to enable the IT practice. Alan, what do you think?
Well, I actually see, as far as the impact of DevOps, I think whatever strategy is going to meet your organization's needs, DevOps can actually help you to streamline either of those two approaches. There are cases, and many organizations actually don't make a good enough use of it, where commercial law as a service kinds of applications will do an excellent job of meeting their needs, and we don't even need to have our own platform. We can just use their cloud-based services and be in great shape. But when you do have something that you need to actually build yourself and have something that's unique to your company, then that's where the platform as a service starts coming in. But as far as managing either of those two scenarios, DevOps gives us the tools and mechanisms to manage either of them. So I don't know that DevOps is going to push us towards one or the other. It should be business priorities that push us towards one or the other.
Well, I'd like to thank both Alan and Chris for a great presentation today. And I'd also like to thank today's sponsor, ASPE, for providing the DZone audience with a great webinar presentation. And lastly, thank you to everyone who joined us for today's presentation. We hope you learned something new today. I know I did. That will help you in your developer career. And I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Thanks,
everybody.